Have you ever wondered why you feel exhausted around certain people, even when nothing dramatic seems to happen? It is one of the most silent forms of spiritual erosion, this subtle draining that creeps into your energy field long before your mind understands what is happening. When you begin to walk a path of higher awareness, when your perception sharpens and your emotional boundaries become clearer, you start noticing something unsettling. Not everyone around you is meant to stay. Some individuals do not simply take your time or attention. They drain your clarity, your peace, your inner alignment, and they do it in ways so delicate that you barely detect the shift until you are already depleted. And here is the icebreaker most people do not expect. Draining people rarely appear as villains. They often mask themselves as the ones who need you, who depend on you, who just want to talk. Their patterns blend into your routine until your emotional landscape is shaped more by their turbulence than by your own truth. You sense it in your body before you name it in your mind. The heaviness, the subtle anxiety, the feeling of being spiritually pulled downward every time they enter your space. Awareness makes this contrast impossible to ignore, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because recognizing emotional drain is part of every awakening journey. You may have lived this without realizing it. You show up with generosity, and somehow you leave feeling smaller. You listen with compassion, and somehow your voice grows quieter. You try to help, and somehow your spirit feels dimmer. Has this happened to you? What you will uncover as we continue may surprise you, so before moving on, share in the comments if you have ever felt your energy drain around someone. Leave a like to support the message, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next, as this understanding deepens in ways that reveal even more. Beneath the surface, when you begin to notice these subtle shifts in your inner state, something remarkable happens. Patterns that once felt random start revealing themselves with precision. Draining people are not defined by a single dramatic action, but by a consistent trail of emotional residue they leave behind. Their presence alters your internal rhythm, as if your spirit has to work twice as hard just to stay centered. And what is most striking is that they often operate through behaviors so familiar that you mistake them for normal human interaction. Yet your body knows before your mind admits it. The tightening in your chest, the sudden mental fog, the quiet desire to withdraw. These are early signs that your energy is being pulled into a current that does not belong to you. As your awareness grows, you start decoding these behavioral signals with greater accuracy. Some draining individuals communicate through constant subtle negativity, not loud enough to be called complaints, but persistent enough to shift your emotional state downward. Others rely on passive emotional absorption, drawing your attention to their problems without ever seeking solutions. And then there are those who dominate conversations gently but relentlessly, creating an imbalance where your own thoughts barely have space to breathe. None of these behaviors appear harmful on the surface, but they accumulate like dust in the corners of your mind until you realize how much light they have dimmed. This is where spiritual perception becomes crucial. When you are evolving internally, your sensitivity sharpens not as weakness, but as intuitive intelligence. You begin to sense the difference between someone who is genuinely struggling and someone who is unconsciously feeding off your emotional bandwidth. It is not judgment, it is discernment. And once this discernment activates, it becomes impossible to ignore the way certain people shift your internal landscape. You start noticing how you shrink yourself to keep the peace, how you monitor your tone to avoid triggering their reactions, how your energy bends toward their emotional weight instead of standing in its natural alignment. These small shifts are the first signs of a dynamic that, if left unrecognized, can quietly drain the deepest parts of your strength. As this internal awareness strengthens, you begin to understand that the psychological impact of draining people goes far beyond momentary discomfort. It subtly reshapes the way you think, feel, and respond to the world. When someone consistently pulls your energy downward, your mind starts adapting to their emotional climate. You may become more cautious with your words, more hesitant to express your truth, more willing to silence your intuition, just to maintain harmony. Over time, this creates an invisible tension inside you, a quiet distortion that separates you from your natural state of clarity. What makes this dynamic so challenging is that it often happens gradually. Draining individuals rarely demand large pieces of you all at once. Instead, they take small fragments, moments of attention, emotional openings, gaps in your boundaries. They enter through softness, through empathy, through the parts of you that want to help, support, or simply be kind. And because their influence isn't explosive, you may not realize how deeply it affects you until you feel a persistent heaviness that you cannot explain. Your emotional bandwidth becomes narrower, your patience becomes thinner, your inner peace becomes scattered, and you begin to recognize that this erosion is not coming from your own life circumstances, but from the psychological weight of maintaining someone else's emotional world. This is where the awakening becomes both uncomfortable and liberating. You start noticing how your body reacts when certain people speak. You feel your mind preparing for emotional labor before the conversation even begins. You sense the anticipation of being drained, and this anticipation itself becomes a sign of how deeply the pattern has taken root. The mind becomes exhausted not from the interaction alone, but from bracing for it. And beneath all of this lies a deeper truth. Draining people do not simply take your energy, they disrupt your connection to yourself. They create a subtle internal noise that makes it harder to hear your intuition, harder to stay grounded, harder to move through life with the emotional freedom you deserve. Once you see this with clarity, the psychological impact becomes unmistakable, revealing layers of influence that you may have been absorbing for far longer than you realized. As this deeper understanding unfolds, you begin to recognize that not all draining individuals reveal themselves through obvious emotional turbulence. Some are far quieter, almost invisible in the way they pull from you. These are the ones who exhaust you without a single argument, without a raised voice, without any dramatic expression. Their draining effect lies in the subtle emotional imbalance they create, an imbalance that forces you to carry both your own energy and theirs. They do not attack your peace, they lean on it until it begins to bend. You may notice this type of person in the way they always seem overwhelmed, but never take steps to change. They present themselves as fragile, perpetually confused, or emotionally lost, and because you are empathetic, your instinct is to support, to guide, to stabilize. Yet instead of growing, they remain in the same emotional place, relying on your strength to maintain their equilibrium. Over time, you become the emotional anchor they cling to, even when they appear gentle, soft-spoken, or kind. And while nothing chaotic happens around them, your internal world starts reflecting a fatigue that does not belong to you. This dynamic becomes even more draining because it blurs the line between compassion and self-neglect. You begin offering more than you should because it feels natural to help, but the imbalance grows so gradually that you barely notice the shift. Their presence creates a constant emotional undertone, a subtle sense that you must always be available, always listening, always steady. And when you finally step back, even for a moment, guilt tries to take the place of your intuition. But your intuition is telling you something essential. Peace should not require sacrifice every time someone else enters your space. As your spiritual perception evolves, you start noticing these patterns faster. You sense when someone expects you to be their emotional home without offering anything that nourishes your inner world in return. And this awareness is not cold, it is clarity. It is the recognition that protecting your energy is not abandonment, it is alignment with what strengthens your growth. If you have ever met someone who drained you gently and silently, share your experience in the comments. Your insight might help someone recognize what they have been feeling all along. As your awareness sharpens, you begin to see that draining relationships are not defined only by the other person's behavior, but also by the emotional patterns they awaken within you. There is often an invisible dynamic at play, one that keeps you giving more than you receive without fully understanding why. It begins with small emotional exchanges that seem harmless, yet each interaction subtly pulls you away from your center. You may notice that after spending time with certain individuals, your thoughts feel scattered, your emotions feel heavier, and your sense of self feels less grounded. This shift is not accidental. It is the result of an emotional pattern that has developed over time. One of the most powerful realizations is that your energy responds long before your logic does. You feel tense before you understand the reason. You feel uneasy before you interpret the signal, and you feel the urge to withdraw before you can articulate the imbalance. This is not weakness. It is inner intelligence speaking through sensation instead of words. And once you begin listening to these signals, you uncover a truth that changes everything. Your spirit has been responding to emotional drain long before your mind learned to recognize it. These draining dynamics often form when roles become unbalanced. You might become the rescuer, the supporter, the emotional stabilizer, the one who absorbs stress so the other person doesn't collapse under it. This pattern can feel natural, especially for someone who is compassionate, intuitive, or spiritually sensitive. But over time, the constant imbalance reshapes your internal rhythm. You begin anticipating the other person's needs before they are spoken, adjusting your energy to maintain peace, and carrying emotional weight that should not be yours to bear. And the most revealing part is that these patterns do not always begin with malicious intent. Sometimes people unconsciously rely on those who appear strong, grounded, or emotionally resilient. But regardless of intention, the effect remains the same. Your inner world becomes crowded with responsibilities that do not belong to you, and gradually, without realizing it, you lose sight of how much energy you have been giving away simply by maintaining a connection that continually pulls you downward. As this understanding deepens, you begin to realize that behind every draining relationship lies a hidden pattern you may not have seen before. It is not simply about how the other person behaves, but about the emotional cycle that forms between you and them. This cycle tends to repeat itself with uncanny familiarity, almost as if the relationship has a script that both of you follow without ever questioning it. And the moment you start observing it from a place of clarity, the entire structure becomes visible. Often the pattern begins with subtle dependency. The draining person gravitates toward your stability, sensing your calm, your strength, or your ability to bring balance into chaotic situations. They begin leaning on you emotionally, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that feel harmless at first. But over time, the dynamic shifts. You become the grounding force, the emotional filter, the stabilizer who absorbs their unrest. And while you may not realize it in the beginning, you gradually step into a role that was never meant to be yours. The most revealing part is how this dynamic affects your internal world. You may start managing your emotions in relation to theirs, adjusting your mood, your reactions, and even your silence to keep the balance. When they are anxious, you soften. When they are overwhelmed, you become steady. When they feel lost, you offer direction. These actions might feel compassionate, but compassion becomes imbalance when it consistently costs you your own emotional equilibrium. The hidden pattern thrives in this imbalance, feeding on your willingness to stay grounded while the other person remains unchanged. And as you begin to awaken spiritually, this imbalance becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. You start noticing the moments when your intuition tightens, when your peace feels compromised, when your inner voice whispers that something is not aligned. These subtle signals are your spirit's way of revealing the pattern that has been draining you for far longer than you realized. And once you see it clearly, the dynamic begins to unravel. You recognize the emotional cost of maintaining a connection that keeps pulling you out of yourself, and this awareness becomes the first step toward reclaiming the energy that has been slipping from you one unnoticed moment at a time. As you become more attuned to these emotional cycles, a new clarity begins to rise within you. You start noticing behaviors that once felt insignificant, but now reveal themselves as clear indicators of who should not remain in your life. One of the most telling signs is the way certain individuals react to your growth. When your awareness expands, when your emotional boundaries strengthen, when your inner world becomes more grounded, draining people often respond with subtle discomfort. They may not say anything directly, but you feel it, an uneasiness in their tone, a shift in their attitude, a quiet resistance to the change unfolding within you. This reaction is not about your evolution itself. It is about the loss of the emotional dynamic they depended on. Your growth disrupts the pattern that allowed them to lean on your strength without ever developing their own. And so, instead of celebrating your clarity, they may respond with passive disappointment, sudden distance, or small comments that make you question your direction. These are the moments when your intuition speaks the loudest, reminding you that true connection does not shrink in the presence of your growth. It expands. Another powerful indicator lies in how they handle your boundaries. When you begin to protect your energy, draining individuals often test those boundaries in subtle ways, as if trying to see whether your newfound strength is temporary. They may expect the same emotional availability as before, assuming you will continue carrying what no longer belongs to you. But as you evolve, the emotional weight you once tolerated becomes impossible to ignore, and this shift exposes their dependence with striking clarity. And perhaps the most revealing sign is how you feel after interacting with them. If your spirit feels dimmed, if your mind feels clouded, if your emotions feel heavier than before, these sensations are not random. They are signals. Your awakened perception allows you to sense the truth beneath the surface, guiding you toward relationships that nourish rather than drain your inner world. If you have noticed these subtle reactions or emotional shifts around certain people, share your experience in the comments. Your perspective may help someone recognize the signs they have been overlooking. As your consciousness expands, something profound begins to shift in how you relate to others. You no longer respond solely from habit or emotional reflex. Instead, you begin navigating your connections with a heightened sense of discernment. This new awareness acts like a quiet internal compass, guiding you toward relationships that align with your growth and away from those that dim your clarity. It is not about rejecting people or withdrawing from the world. It is about recognizing what your spirit can and cannot carry anymore. One of the most transformative realizations is that the more awakened you become, the more sensitive you grow to emotional imbalance. Not in a fragile way, but in a perceptive one. You start noticing how your energy responds to different environments, how your intuition reacts to certain personalities, and how your inner state shifts when someone enters your space. What once felt like mild discomfort now appears as clear evidence of misalignment, and this clarity becomes impossible to ignore. This heightened awareness allows you to see the roots of draining dynamics with new eyes. You recognize when someone's presence requires you to shrink your emotions, mute your thoughts, or carry a weight that disrupts your internal rhythm. You see how certain patterns repeat themselves, not because you are weak, but because your spirit was conditioned to prioritize harmony over authenticity. But awakening changes that. It teaches you that protecting your energy is not selfish. It is essential for living a life aligned with truth. You also begin noticing how your silence, your boundaries, or even your distance can trigger unexpected reactions in others. Some people adjust gracefully, respecting the new space you are creating. Others resist, not because they value the relationship, but because they depended on the version of you who once tolerated the imbalance. This contrast reveals more about them than about you, highlighting the profound shift happening in your inner world. And as this process unfolds, your perception becomes clearer, your emotional landscape steadier, and your sense of self stronger. You start moving through life with a growing recognition of what nourishes your spirit and what quietly drains it, allowing your relationships to transform as your awareness deepens. As this inner clarity grows stronger, you begin to understand that releasing draining connections is not an act of abandonment, but an act of inner liberation. Something subtle yet powerful happens inside you. The emotional fog begins to lift. You start recognizing how much of your mental and spiritual space had been occupied by people who were never aligned with your evolution. This realization does not arrive as anger. It comes as calm awareness, the kind that settles quietly in the mind and reshapes the way you see everything around you. You start noticing the difference in how you feel when you are surrounded by people who respect your inner world. Your thoughts flow more freely, your emotions remain grounded, and your intuition becomes sharper. There is no heaviness, no tension beneath the surface, no silent pressure to carry what does not belong to you. Instead, there is a sense of expansion, as if your spirit finally has room to breathe again. This contrast reveals how deeply certain relationships had been affecting you, often without your conscious awareness. What becomes even more evident is how releasing draining individuals creates a kind of emotional reset. You begin reclaiming energy you did not realize you had lost. Your creativity returns, your focus strengthens, and your internal dialogue becomes clearer. You stop rehearsing conversations in your mind, stop bracing for emotional weight, stop negotiating your peace to accommodate someone else's chaos. The absence of that pull allows your natural state to re-emerge, and this state is far more balanced than you remembered. And as you continue walking this awakened path, you start seeing your life through a renewed lens. Relationships that once felt difficult now appear incompatible with who you are becoming. You no longer feel obligated to hold what drains you. You no longer confuse compassion with responsibility. You no longer accept dynamics that pull you out of alignment. Instead, you begin choosing connections that reflect the strength, clarity, and inner steadiness you have been cultivating. This shift is not sudden. It is a quiet unfolding, a gradual return to your true emotional orientation. As you reach this stage of awareness, something profound begins to settle within you. You start understanding that the true transformation was never about the people you released, but about the space that opened inside you once they were gone. This new space feels lighter, clearer, more aligned with your inner truth. It is as if the emotional noise that once dominated your days has finally quieted, allowing your intuition to speak with strength and precision. You no longer move through life bracing for someone else's turbulence. Instead, you step forward with a grounded sense of who you are and what your spirit can hold. What becomes unmistakable is the way your energy shifts when you are no longer tied to draining dynamics. Your thoughts become sharper, your emotional balance steadier, your decisions more aligned with the person you are becoming rather than the person you had to be in order to survive certain relationships. This internal transformation is not loud, it is gentle, almost silent, unfolding in the calmness you feel when you wake up, in the clarity that guides your choices, in the peace that surrounds your days. And with time, you realize that this peace is not a luxury. It is your natural state, the one you return to when the weight of misaligned connections is finally removed. As this new emotional space expands, life begins responding differently. You attract people who respect your boundaries, who value your presence without demanding your energy, who walk beside you instead of pulling you off your path. These connections feel effortless, not because they are perfect, but because they flow from alignment rather than imbalance. And in this flow, you rediscover parts of yourself that had been overshadowed by emotional weight. Strength returns. Clarity returns. The quiet confidence that comes from choosing yourself returns. If you felt connected to this message, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue receiving content that supports your growth. And if you made it all the way to the end, leave a comment saying something like "I am here until the end" or "This message was for me, so I know this resonated with you." If the video added value to your day, feel free to leave a like as well. There is another video here that continues this journey in a powerful way. So click and keep walking with me as we explore even deeper layers of inner awareness.